Well, this is a picture of my dad and mom. It was a wedding picture. Like I mentioned earlier, or may have, when my dad was stationed in Jefferson Barracks, and I'm guessing it was, I don't know, 41, I'm not sure. I have to look that up. But he was an NCO, he was not an officer then. And he met mom at a dance, and they started dating. And eventually he had an opportunity to go to officer candidate school, which ironically is what I ended up doing. And he went to Fort Benning, Georgia. And when he got commissioned, mom took the train down to get married. And when she arrived, she was expecting to be able to get all dressed up the next day for a wedding. And my dad said, I've got the church, I've got the minister, and they're waiting. So, and I have no idea if it was middle of the day or when it was, but she took a train from St. Louis down to Fort Benning is in Columbus, Georgia. And so they got married, and that's a picture. Dad in his uniform as a brand new second lieutenant, and mom and in a dress-up dress. And
were those just the clothes she wore on the train that day?
Nah, I doubt it. I don't know.
But it's obviously not a wedding dress.
Well, no. They didn't have a big fancy wedding. No, they were just, they had it just as a piece, and I don't even know who stood up for either one of them, but probably another military couple. Anyway, then in 1943, before Dad went overseas to the Pacific, is when I was born. So that, I should remember, when did Mom and Dad get married? And Dad was in the Pacific for over 2 years. And back then you didn't have cell phones and letters. Letters is what you did. And my mom gave him a diary to keep. And I found that diary after they had both passed. And I transcribed it, typed it up, and made copies and sent it to all our kids, my brother, etc. I think I still have it on a computer, but all 4 of my kids have a copy of it. And it is a daily entry. When he was overseas, he was in places first he was in Guadalcanal, then it was Bougainville, those are islands, and then the last station he had was in the Philippines. And, in reading that, I respected my dad all along, but he was a company commander, first to second lieutenant, I think came back as a captain. But he had a company, a laundry company. Doesn't sound very exciting, but let me tell you, when you could get a fresh set of clothes on after you'd been in the jungles and as hot as it was out in the Pacific, it's pretty important. I have a big respect for what support and logistics is to the Army, since I was in the Army for 28 years. Anyway, when Dad came home, he ended up going to work as a civilian for an Army agency, but he also stayed in Army Reserves. And he ended up getting 20 good years in, which qualifies you for reserve retirement. And not that I tried to emulate him, but I did the same thing. And so he worked for what became the Army Aviation Command, which is the same entity that I ended up working for and retiring from as a civilian, just like him. You know, it's ironic how things happen. So, and I have one brother, Larry, and he worked for several different employers, telephone company, school districts, Boeing, steel company, school districts. Anyway.
Do you would have been around too when your father came home? Do you remember that at all, or?
No, because I was probably 2 years old.
Yeah, that's.
I remember as a kid looking out the window and seeing the car pull up with Mom holding my brother, because he was born in 47. I was born in 43.
Wow.
So I remember that. We lived in a frame 2-story house through 5th grade in St. Louis. I would walk to school, like I said, through 5th grade. And I guess we were like 1, 2, maybe 3 blocks away from elementary school. And back then, you know, you had small stores, businesses. And halfway on the walk, on the one side of the street on the corner, there was a drugstore. Next to it was a grocery store, which by today's standard was a hole in the wall. But they had, you know, everything, you know, meat, etc. Next to that was a bakery store. And even next to that, there was a parking lot, small business. It burnt down once and then rebuilt, and it was a shoe repair shop. All there. And I remember going to the bakery because they had these toast with coconut and cream on it. And it was a coconut toast or whatever you go. And then they also had the funnels, which you can still get with cream in it. You can find them some places. And that was a block away from school. So like I said, went to school there through 5th grade, and then we moved out to the suburbs, which were not, in our case, was at Shrewsbury, which was just right next to the city. And Shrewsbury was a small town, and you went to public school, you went to Webster Groves School District, which is where my brother and I went. And Mom and Dad, like I said, moved out to Shrewsbury when I started 6th grade. And then stayed in that house until, I guess, after I graduated from college. Small house. My brother and I shared a room. There was one bathroom. Mom and Dad had the other bedroom. It had a long, you know, wasn't very wide, but it was a deep house, kind of like our house here. And so the living room, dining room was long, somewhat narrow. And of course, my dad, as he did there and did it when he moved out in further out in the suburbs. He'd finished the basement off. Didn't have a bathroom though, which would have been better. And then after that, they moved. Funny story. My brother tells it. I guess I was out of school working maybe. I don't think I had moved back home because I moved back home and when I worked on my master's and lived with mom and dad. But he came home to the house in Shrewsbury. He was in school. It was like, I don't know, end of his sophomore. I know exactly when. And he tells a story. He comes home and knocks on the door. Nobody's there. Well, mom and dad had neglected to tell him that they'd moved. He tells a story and it's a lot funnier. But anyway, that's just a fun little thing. And growing up, like I said, we saw my grandma and grandpa Sindler a lot because they lived here in St. Louis. But I think we only went once a year. Maybe when I was younger, it was more than once to see Grandma and Grandpa Turner or, aunts and uncles down in Southwest Missouri, Springfield, Mansfield, or Marshfield. I would say they were strict, but not overly strict. I mean, they gave us a good home. We went to church all the time, which I still do. Not the same church. That church we were there when I was growing up, is no longer a church. I don't know what it is now. And I know the one time I got in trouble.
Only once?
Well, one that I can remember. Well, actually twice. First time it wasn't that big a deal. But I was a camp counselor at a church camp. Forget how old I was. I guess I thought I was older. Anyway, we went, this must have been when I was a camper. That summer after church camp, I think our counselor set up a deal so we went to the baseball game. And he brought us home, etc. Well, we're going to stop and get something to eat. And he said, should you call your parents? I said, no, that's okay. So I didn't get home till probably midnight, 1 o'clock. Of course, the game was over by 10. And my mom was up waiting. She was worried about me, upset. And of course, we didn't have cell phones then. Yeah. And I was about to call. I mean, well, I don't have to call my mom. Of course, my dad was sleeping, just like I did when my kids were growing up. So, but the other time that I got much bigger trouble when I was a senior in high school, we only had one car. Of course, I had to lobby to get a car, to use the car. And my brother was, in 8th grade? So I didn't have any competition for the car. And I was dating a girl up in North St. Louis County, which was a long trek. It was probably that time, we didn't have all the interstates, so it probably took me maybe an hour to get up there. But I met her at church camp. One of the high school church camps, because I went to 4 high school camps as a camper in high school. Well, I invented ways to use the car. In other words, well, I'm going to do this. They didn't like me driving all the way up there, but I did. And my mom found a letter on my desk which revealed the fact that I had been driving up there to see her. She was a year younger. So I got grounded. But, that's understandable. I should have got grounded. My dad did have a temper once in a while. I had a lawn cutting business just like my son Gary Jr. had. In fact, I think my brother took it over when I went away to college. And I remember one time my dad got mad at me because he said, "You need to cut that grass." I said, "Well, I'm going to wait till the ball game's over." Baseball game. Cardinals.
Yeah.
So he got so mad at me, he started running after me. And he slipped and fell and broke his elbow. And I felt bad for him. And that was one bad thing. So, all true confessions to you. And one of the things my brother and I did as we grew up had trains, electric trains, Lionel trains. We'd always put the Lionel trains up. And then when I got married, I ended up doing HO trains because they took up less room. And then my brother had the Lionel trains. And then eventually I said, well, half of it's mine, so I want to get half of it to my son. So he has the other half. When we started having kids, my mom and dad, their grandpa and grandma, lived in South County, St. Louis, and had a pretty good sized house. Whenever they moved, they went to a bigger house. So for the first few years, when my oldest daughter, Jenna, was born, and then when Gary Jr., we would go over to mom and dad's, and they would watch the kids time, and they eventually, when Jenny was born, she was there, I think once or twice. I know one time we went on a vacation and Jenny wasn't old enough, so she stayed with Grandma and Grandpa Turner. Well, later on, they moved and bought a house outside of Cuba, Missouri. 22 acres, had a pond, and my dad planted fruit trees. He had a pond and a big garden. He'd had a garden in South County, but when he moved out there, he had a bigger garden. And they would have my kids, once they moved down there, they'd have them one at a time for a week or two on end. And they taught them different things that, of course, my mom, Grandma, would teach my 3 girls how to sew and different things like that. And, but he taught them all to go fishing because he had the pond. Actually had 2 ponds, but one was real little, the other one was bigger. And he had a rowboat, so they would go out in the boat. And Dad had this fetish for gray geese. He had a pen, and he'd put them in the pen at night to protect them from the coyotes, etc. Well, gray geese are not very friendly. They can snip at you, etc. Anyway, I think, it was a fun experience and learning experience for my four kids. Different things that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to impart to them. And well, they had, it was one-on-one, etc.
Yeah.
It's kind of like me and Grandma like having you kids down over the years because, you know, we like to have fun with you. I'm not so sure we touch it a whole lot, other than fill the bird feeders, water the flowers, uh, and then you can see back here, Grandma started sewing, and then I even did some woodwork when when the firstborn of each four of my kids, I made a cradle for each one. Not that I am a good woodworker. And since Hannah was the firstborn, she probably got the most rustic, inexperienced. I got better as I went along, although I think it was pretty nice. I had a pattern. But getting back to what you said, what you asked, is that I think my kids really enjoyed my mom and dad as grandma and grandpa. And they certainly enjoyed it because when Jenna, my oldest, was born, that was the first girl that my dad had to see grow up as a baby because he had two sons and no. In fact, that reminds me, my my mom had a miscarriage in between my birth and my brother's. And she always said, well, that probably was my daughter. So it's kind of like Grandma Pat told you about the daughter that her great grandparents lost.
Yeah.
Except she was 5 years old. So.
Yeah.